It was rough. Musicians union was there, but they weren't of much help at the time. I was never happy. I guess what drives me to tear things apart.
There is something about reaching your 60s that strips away the filters. The need to impress fades. The energy spent on keeping up appearances quietly dissolves. And what remains is something far more valuable than fame or reputation. What remains is truth. For Eddie Van Halen, a man who spent decades as the most imitated, most celebrated, and most misunderstood guitarist in rock history, that truth came with a complicated edge. Because behind the Brown sound, behind the Frankenstrat, behind those impossibly fluid solos that made grown musicians weep with disbelief, there were names. Names that stirred something in Eddie that he rarely let the public see. Not just admiration, not just rivalry. Something rawer than either of those things. By the time Eddie reached 62, he had lived more than most musicians dream of living. He had shaken the foundation of rock guitar at 23 with a solo that the world still cannot fully explain. He had sold out arenas across 5 continents, recorded albums that defined entire eras, and built instruments by hand in his workshop like a medieval craftsman obsessed with chasing the perfect tone. But he had also carried wounds. Quiet ones. The kind that come not from enemies, but from the people you once looked up to, the ones whose records you wore out as a teenager, the ones whose technique you studied until your fingertips bled, and sometimes the ones whose talent made you feel both inspired and unsettled in the same breath. What follows is not a story about bitterness. Eddie Van Halen was many things, but bitter was never truly one of them. This is a story about what happens when the most gifted guitarist of his generation collides with the complex, ego-charged, brilliant-soaked world of rock royalty. 6 guitarists. 6 relationships that twisted between worship and resentment, between admiration and something that felt uncomfortably close to contempt. 6 names that, when mentioned in a certain tone, could change the expression on Eddie's face entirely. The first name takes us back to the very beginning, to a bedroom in Pasadena, where a teenage boy sat cross-legged on the floor with a cheap guitar and a stack of vinyl records. Eric Clapton was not just a guitarist to young Eddie Van Halen. He was the reason, the absolute, undeniable reason that Eddie picked up an instrument in the first place. He would spend entire evenings, sometimes stretching into the early hours of morning, trying to decode what Clapton was doing on recordings like Crossroads. The phrasing, the bends, the way silence was used as a weapon just as much as sound itself. Eddie absorbed it all. He once described Clapton as his main influence, the man he tried to mirror note for note, the closest thing to a musical god that a kid from California could imagine. But gods have a way of disappointing you when you finally meet them as equals. By the late 1970s, Eddie had done something that even his heroes had not managed to do. He had genuinely reinvented what the electric guitar was capable of. When Van Halen's debut album arrived, the guitar world stopped in its tracks. Two-handed tapping, pinch harmonics, whammy bar dives that sounded like fighter jets. The whole sonic vocabulary Eddie had developed alone in a garage suddenly belonged to everyone. He was no longer chasing Clapton. In many ways, he had moved past him entirely. And then came the comment that cut Eddie deeper than almost anything else in his career. Clapton, when asked about Van Halen in 1980, responded with measured coolness. Technically impressive, he suggested, but lacking in soul. For Eddie, those words did not just sting. They devastated. The man whose playing had set him on fire as a teenager was now dismissing everything he had built as mechanical, as empty spectacle. Eddie never responded publicly with anger. He was not wired that way. But people close to him said the hurt lingered for years, surfacing occasionally in quiet moments when the subject came up. He eventually processed it with characteristic grace, acknowledging that he and Clapton simply came from different musical worlds, that one painted in blues and shadows while the other worked in electricity and light. But the wound was real, and even at 62, the memory of that rejection from his first musical hero carried a particular kind of weight that never fully dissolved. The second name on this list belongs to a man whose guitar playing once made Eddie feel like he had heard something supernatural. Ritchie Blackmore of Deep Purple was another idol consumed entirely by that restless teenage mind in Pasadena. Eddie would replay tracks obsessively, dissecting the classical precision in Blackmore's solos, the dramatic tension, the way every note seemed to arrive from a place of absolute conviction. He revered the man, which made what happened when they finally crossed paths in the early years of Van Halen's success all the more crushing. When Eddie met Blackmore, expecting at minimum a moment of mutual acknowledgement between guitarists, he received nothing, a blank stare, a cold wall of indifference. No hello, no recognition, no warmth of any kind. For someone as open and genuinely enthusiastic about music as Eddie was, that kind of deliberate chill registered as something close to a personal insult. He talked about it years later with visible discomfort, describing how it felt to be looked through by someone whose poster had once hung on his wall. Blackmore eventually offered a lukewarm assessment of Eddie's playing, suggesting he used too many notes, a comment that fans of both guitarists debated endlessly. But it revealed the core philosophical divide between them. Blackmore believed in restraint, in space, in the classical tradition of saying more by saying less. Eddie believed in freedom, in chaos, in the full-throated joy of letting a guitar do whatever it wanted to do. Neither was wrong, but they could not have been further apart. To his credit, Eddie never let that cold encounter curdle into lasting bitterness. By his 60s, he could speak about Blackmore with genuine appreciation, acknowledging the brilliance that had first captured him as a boy. And Blackmore himself eventually offered something approaching real recognition, admitting that what Eddie did with tapping and the whammy bar was genuinely new and genuinely clever. It was not the warmth Eddie had once hoped for, but it was something. The third figure in this complicated gallery is Joe Perry, the Aerosmith guitarist whose swagger and blues-drenched tone have been another touchstone for Eddie in his formative years. The experience with Perry was similar in texture to what happened with Blackmore, that same devastating coldness from someone Eddie had genuinely admired. On the early tours, when Van Halen was still establishing itself and Eddie was still young enough to feel the thrill of sharing space with his heroes, Perry essentially looked through him. No acknowledgement, no connection. Nothing resembling the shared respect that Eddie, naively perhaps, had hoped might exist between guitarists who loved the instrument. Eddie described it plainly and without much softening. The attitude from players like Perry felt territorial, as though a younger guitarist playing with fearless invention was a threat to be frozen out rather than a talent to be welcomed. The old guard, built on blues grooves and riff-heavy attitude, seemed to look at Eddie's two-handed tapping and harmonic experimentation the way an established kingdom looks at a new country forming on its border, with suspicion, with competitive anxiety dressed up as indifference. What makes this particular relationship interesting is what came later. By 2013, Joe Perry had completely reversed his position, speaking about Eddie with open, unguarded admiration. He described hearing Van Halen's debut album as a revelation, something that floored him completely, something he kept returning to in order to understand how it was done. That kind of retroactive respect speaks to the sheer force of Eddie's impact. Even those who had once frozen him out could not ultimately deny what he had contributed. But for Eddie, those early years of cold shoulders from the people he had grown up idolizing left a mark, not one that defined him, but one that he never entirely forgot. The fourth name represents a different kind of tension, less personal, more philosophical, and rooted in a specific incident that stayed with Eddie for years. Tom Scholz of Boston occupied a fascinating position in the rock world of the late 1970s. An MIT-trained engineer who built his own recording equipment and approached music with the precision of a scientist, Scholz was in almost every conceivable way the opposite of Eddie Van Halen. Where Eddie played by feel and instinct, trusting his hands to find the right note in real time, Scholz calculated, calibrated, and constructed with methodical care. The incident that sparked Eddie's frustration occurred during a shared bill when Scholz appeared to replicate Eddie's solo in his own performance, leaving the audience visibly confused and Eddie visibly annoyed. The exact intentions behind what Scholz did that day were never made entirely clear, but for Eddie, the experience fed into a broader frustration with the way his innovations were being absorbed and repeated by other musicians. He had built his sound entirely from scratch, wiring his own guitars, blowing up his own amplifiers in search of a tone that did not yet exist. Watching that sound get reproduced on stage by someone else, particularly someone with Scholz's profile, felt like a violation of something sacred. Eddie believed deeply in originality, not as a competitive weapon, but as a fundamental artistic responsibility. His father had taught him that if you play someone else's music, you make it your own. That philosophy was not just a rule for him. It was the whole point. Music that did not come from somewhere genuinely personal was, in Eddie's view, barely music at all. The show's episode reinforced something he had already been sensing as his fame grew. The more visible his innovations became, the more they became available to anyone willing to copy them. And while imitation might be the sincerest form of flattery, it was also, sometimes, the most deeply irritating. The fifth name on this list brings us to an episode of confrontation that was rare for Eddie, who typically kept his frustrations private. Rick Derringer was a veteran guitarist with a genuine history and a reputation that Eddie respected. When Derringer opened for Van Halen in 1978, Eddie watched with growing disbelief as Derringer appeared to perform not just similar techniques, but his actual melodies, his specific phrasing, note for note and phrase for phrase, in front of the same audience. Eddie confronted him directly after the show, expressing his frustration with a clarity that mixed admiration and genuine hurt. He was not angry about the tapping technique being used. He was angry about something more fundamental, his musical identity being borrowed wholesale. When Derringer repeated the behavior the following night, even closing his set with a song that Van Halen had made their own as a live anthem, Eddie drew a line. Derringer was removed from the tour. It was one of the few moments in Eddie's career where his feelings about artistic ownership translated into direct action, and it said something important about how seriously he took the idea of musical identity. He later acknowledged with some self-awareness that he himself had absorbed other players' techniques early in his development. The distinction he drew was between learning from someone and stealing from them, between being inspired and being a replica. That distinction mattered enormously to him. And then there is the sixth name, the one that carries the most complexity, the most emotional weight, and perhaps the most revealing light on who Eddie Van Halen actually was beneath all the virtuosity and the fame. Randy Rhoads was not someone Eddie dismissed or looked down upon. Randy Rhoads was someone Eddie could not stop thinking about, and that inability to stop thinking about him was, in its own way, the most profound form of rivalry imaginable. Both men emerged in the early 1980s as the defining guitar voices of a new era. Both were rewriting what the instrument could do. Both were being relentlessly compared to each other in every magazine, every conversation, every corner of the rock world. For Eddie, who had spent years establishing himself as the undisputed innovator, the arrival of Randy Rhoads with his classical training and his astonishing precision represented something more unsettling than simple competition. It represented the possibility of being displaced, of watching the language you invented being spoken more fluently by someone else. Eddie's comments about Rhoads, captured in archive recordings, were revealing in their carefully constructed defensiveness. He acknowledged Rhoads' talent, while simultaneously drawing a sharp line around his own territory, noting that everything Rhoads did had already been explored by Eddie himself. There was truth in that, and there was also something unmistakably human about needing to say it. The fact that Eddie felt compelled to establish the hierarchy suggested that the competition was genuinely felt, genuinely uncomfortable, and genuinely important to him in a way that went beyond ordinary professional rivalry. Rhoads, by the accounts of those who knew him, felt the comparison equally. His guitar technician reportedly taped a photograph of Eddie Van Halen to the bottom of Randy's wah pedal, meaning that every time Rhoads used it on stage, he was quite literally standing on Eddie's image. It was humorous on the surface. It was something else entirely underneath. Two brilliant young men, each carrying the weight of reputation built on originality, each aware that the other represented the closest thing to a real rival they had ever encountered. What makes the story of Eddie and Randy so uniquely sad is that it was never resolved. Randy Rhoads died in a plane crash in 1982, young and extraordinary, and full of a future that never arrived. The rivalry was frozen at that moment, suspended permanently in whatever unfinished state it occupied. Eddie never got to watch Rhoads continue to evolve, never got to see whether the comparisons would persist or dissolve as both men found their own mature voices. The competition simply stopped mid-sentence, and Eddie was left to sit with feelings that could never be properly processed because the other person was gone. In later years, when Eddie spoke about Rhoads, the sharpness had faded. What remained was something quieter and more honest. Perhaps he understood, looking back, that his feelings about Randy were never really about hatred at all. They were about recognition, the complicated, uncomfortable recognition that comes when you see your own reflection in someone else and cannot decide whether to embrace it or push it away. That is a thread that runs through all 6 of these relationships. The thing that connects Clapton's dismissal, Blackmore's cold stare, Perry's territorial indifference, Scholl's imitation, Derringer's note-for-note theft, and Rhodes' parallel brilliance. Every one of these situations, at its core, was about identity, about Eddie's desperate, burning need to be understood as something genuinely original, genuinely his own, a man who had built his guitar by hand, who had spent years alone in a garage inventing a sound that the world had never heard before, who had given everything he had to the idea of musical authenticity. When that authenticity felt challenged, whether by dismissal from above or imitation from beside him, the response was always the same. Not rage, not public feuding, just a quiet, deep, unmistakable hurt. By the time Eddie reached his 60s, most of those wounds had transformed into something more nuanced. Wisdom, perhaps, or simply the perspective that comes from having outlasted most of the arguments. He still loved music the way he had loved it at 15, with his whole self, with a joy that was almost childlike in its purity. He still talked about guitars the way other people talk about breathing, as though the instrument was not something he played, but something he was. And when the names of those 6 guitarists came up, even the ones who had hurt him, even the ones who had copied him or dismissed him or stared coldly through him, what you heard in his voice was not hatred at all. What you heard was a complicated love of a man who cared so much about music that everything connected to it, even the pain, was precious. That is who Eddie Van Halen was at 62. Not a man consumed by grudges. A man who had simply loved too hard and too honestly pretend that none of it had mattered.